All right, thank you, Nick, for that. Good morning, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful day. All right, going to Unit 3 here. Leading and managing recovery. That's what we're going to discuss today, leading and managing recovery. Some things to look upon is upon completion of this unit, you'll be able to identify sources of financial assistance that's available to the community. You can describe the function of the unmet needs committee, and we'll get more into that as we go along. And we'll explain the importance of proper documentation, as Nick was covering earlier. You're going to describe the actions a community leader can take to lead the community through recovery. And you're going to describe the role of a recovery leader, and we're going to be applying learning points to solve problems faced by a recovery task force. A couple of things we need to look at here. There are many issues during the recovery process that require strong management skills. Here's a few of these things that's listed on the slide. Cost recovery is a major one, because you got to see how much recovery costs. Creative financing. The documentation. Without proper documentation, you can't see how much the cost of recovery is going to be. Project management. There's always ongoing projects during this recovery phase. Legal issues. Some of the things you're going to run across. Staffing issues. Do you have enough staff to provide for recovery? And assistance to disaster survivors. I know earlier in Unit 2 we mentioned about disaster survivors, but we're going to cover a few more bases during this course. There are numerous federal programs in the agency outside of FEMA that may provide recovery assistance. Now, the program range from direct disaster programs to various unique and focused support. Now, according to the Stafford Act, the FEMA shared presidential declared disasters are generally about 75% of eligible recovery costs that are reimbursed to the state and local government. Now, following a presidential disaster declaration, some states pay all the remaining 25%. Not to make the community whole again, it just providing a secure and safe.
Patrick?
Yes.
Real quick, looks like we're having some audio issues. Just want to do a quick audio check. Is everybody here able to hear me? Okay. Is everybody able to hear Patrick? Patrick, can you do a test real quick?
Not Patrick. No sound. That's strange. Let's try. Let's see. Now, can everybody hear me?
Okay. Sounds like that's better.
All right.
Should
breaking up IV. Fixed. Okay. Okay. Thanks for the input. I don't know what happened. I do have an electrical storm over my head, so if it breaks up again, just let me know. All right. Ready, Nick?
Ready to go.
All right. Earlier we mentioned creative financing. No, when you're restructuring the local budget, and generally the first option is to exercise in a post-disaster situation. The unobligated general funds and reserves may be obligated to assist in funding recovery activities. So in more severe situations, existing budgets may be reallocated to offset expenses. restructuring local budget, insurance, and financing. The community may be further impacted by the loss of some of the tax base due to the loss of residents, business, and jobs. Insurance in the first line of defense, property loss. That's one of the first things that people look for. Be aware that self-insured jurisdictions may be required to spend down their self-insurance limits before additional assistance will be available. The determination of insurance coverage is the primary consideration for public assistance program eligibility. That's one of the biggest ones. So finances may be necessary to cover recovery costs. The primary ways local governments borrow money is through a bond issued and tax program. Most government programs have the authority to finance bond issues. I mean to break up. The sound continue to break up. Can everybody hear me?
Patrick, I can hear you.
Okay. As I was saying earlier, like the bond issues and tax programs, because most governments have the authority to finance bond issues, but may have to enact legislation for tax programs. So they make some arrangements that may also be made with banks for short-term loans. You got to think about some partnerships here. They may be good for options for projects related to special interests, down payment associated, parks, revitalizations, and on and on. In some cases, nonprofit businesses and foundations have provided grants for special projects related to the community recovery. Cost sharing with the jurisdiction, when appropriate, may also provide creative funding in some cases. Now let's look at some assistance to disaster survivors. Now, some of the additions to FEMA's individual assistance programs, there are a variety of volunteer organizations, the advocate groups, and social services agencies that may be able to assist survivors with disaster recovery issues. So while not generally, what is not generally is the role of local governments to provide direct assistance to individuals and families, it may be important to help organize these services in a way that enhances access to members of the community. So that's why it is important to know that what agencies and organizations exist within the community that may be able to help with individual needs during the recovery. Now, these agencies and organizations may be grouped into one. A disaster recovery organization is called the Unmet Needs Committee. And here we go, the Unmet Needs Committee. Now, so not all needs can be met by the traditional state and federal assistance programs. Some, even in voluntary agencies, have a specific scope of services that may not meet all needs. That's called the Unmet Needs Committee. They can help use in situations where traditional programs are not meeting the needs, or when the event is not large enough to have made a program available. Some unmet needs will be developed rules and operating. This might include developing an operational plan, meeting frequencies, and establishing client confidentiality policies. This is how resources will be committed. Remember, in some situations, not all disasters get covered. So that's what the Unmet Needs Committee, that's what they're for. Here's something that you talked about earlier, documentation. Because documentation is very important. They support the reimbursement. The accurate and complete documentation will help ensure the maximum level of state and federal assistance is received. Guarantees of state and federal assistance, local governments should follow up the same documentation guidelines. Local governments should be very proactive by establishing documentation policies and procedures before disaster strikes. Staff should be trained in documentation policies and procedures prior to a disaster. Some of the notes you got to look at is that documentation procedures should be in place for the following documents. Now, some big ones are contracts. Everybody has a contract. Procurement process. Must gather that. Project tracking. Expense reports. And your grant. Those are some big ones. Apologies. Hit the wrong button. Some of the things are some other documentation we can look at. Insurance claims, as we said earlier. Wage rates. FEMA has a big issue with wage rates. You got to make sure they're correct. And some other person-related policies. You got to make sure they're kept. Because failure to keep the detailed, accurate documentation may result in jurisdictions returning funds to FEMA. I've seen it in many cases where funds are returned for improper documentation. Now, a couple of questions I have. Does your jurisdiction have basic procedures in place? This is for everybody to volunteer, so you can put it inside the question box or the chat box and answer these questions. So take about 2 minutes, read over this, and answer some of these questions. Are there procurement, do you have procurement procedures in place? Can everybody hear me still?
Patrick, I can hear you. Is everybody on the line able to hear Patrick and answer those questions? Okay, perfect.
All right, so what I want y'all to do is take about a minute, 30 seconds here, and just read over these questions and just answer them in the chat box or in the questions thing here. Have documentation force account labor rates. Have you seen those documents before? Another question is, are there specific disaster recovery documentation required in your state? Some of the things, who will be responsible for developing these policies, procedures? You got to have the right people in place to develop these. If not, go to neighboring counties. All right. Thank you, Tammy, for your response, and Timothy. All right, Nancy, you just mentioned something. We have all the mentions, and you have all the forms and processes in place when the EOC is activated. That's awesome. No worry about the spell check. I understood every word. All right, thank you for your response. Let's move on. Here are some legal issues. Now, it says here, ensure that all legal documents and policies are reviewed by legal staff. Some of the types of documents that should be reviewed by the legal staff are a legal authority, some ordinances, lines of succession. That is very important. Mutual aid agreements. Do you have any with your neighboring counties? Price controls. You don't want anybody to fluctuate the prices. Contracting procedures. That is something very important. I ran into that when I was in Georgia. And pay for immersion work. How are they going to do that? Do you have all the documents in place? This is important as well. The number of additional staff needed to manage recovery efforts will vary from disaster to disaster. Each jurisdiction will be based on their staffing decisions on the size of the event, the amount of damage, the available resources, and the recovery organization structure. Each district will need to determine what it takes to maintain current government functions, the scope of recovery or work to be done on available staff within the organization, and they look at the similar to the gap analysis. Answer these questions will help the jurisdiction decide what additional staff and expertise needed for face recovery challenges. You know, not all disasters sometimes have enough people, so they're always constantly bringing people in. So your local government would need to adequate numbers of the trained staff to manage the workload of recovery efforts. That is key. Since how many staff would be needed, you know, in your jurisdiction? You know, can existing staff be temporarily reassigned? You can put your answers in the chat box or the questions there as I go along. What would you assign staff? Kind of. No, not sure. Probably me. I didn't understand that, Zachary. So what would be some consideration for reassigning staff? Existing skills and expertise. That's one. Do you have any others for reassigning staff? Less required for some of them. It might be lower cost and less expensive staff to handle the lower skill jobs. That's some of the things you can look at. Familiarity with jurisdiction policies and procedures. Where can additional staff be obtained from? Anybody have any answers on that? Where can additional staff be obtained from? I mentioned one of them earlier, mutual aid. They can be from volunteers, professional associations, interns. That's a big one. I've seen that happen. Consultants. They use a lot of those. Recently retired expertise. Jurisdiction debt? Yes. Volunteers from DHS. That's some good answers. Now let's look at another one. How will the stress of the recovery be managed? This is a big one. How are you going to manage the stress? I've seen it firsthand. It's going to be challenging because you're going to work long hours, high stress is created in the recovery. Sometimes when you respond to recovery, hey, there's no power. So these long hours might take toll on people putting all the electrical stuff back. What can you do to manage the staff stress? Bringing dogs. In Puerto Rico, I've seen that every week when I was over there. They always bring the dogs in. That's a good one. Strong leadership. That is very good. Mental health workers. I like that answer. Anybody else? Checking on each other. And that's a big one during disaster, checking on each other. I know I did it all because I'm a people person. Every day I walked in, good morning, how you doing? How's your day? How you feeling today? Are you motivated? Hey, you look tired. That's something we always do. Check on each other. All right. Let's look at leading the recovery. So leading the recovery. One of the primary roles of leadership is to represent the community throughout the recovery process. This is big, like for an FCO or an engineer or somebody that's taken over a disaster. To be successful, lead the recovery and establish a vision for the future leader, they must have solid understanding of the whole community. And this is key. Somebody that have a solid understanding of the whole community, because that's what a leader needs to be. Let's look at some of the traits. Vision for the recovery. So one of the roles of the leader is having a vision for the recovery. They got to establish a vision, setting up the tone for cooperation, fostering relationships with the community partners. They got to guard and support recovery initiatives. They got a lot to do. They got to do some lobbying for support. They got to host VIPs to present partners and potential benefactors. With all this going on, they still got to host. Recovery leaders should be visible and proactive in the course of all the conducting of all these activities. To be a good leader, you got to be strong, stress-free as much as you can, and be able to take care of all this. Some other things about being a leader. Establish a vision for the recovery. Let's look at this. Some of the leaders must be able to envision the community future as the move through the recovery process. So leaders must also be able to impart the vision to others to gain support and enthusiasm for recovery projects and programs. You might look at this. It might be considered the following questions. When creating a vision for their community, these questions may be asked for the staff meeting. How would you define recovery, and what will our community look like when it's achieved? That is, sorry, I'm reading on the chat box. What Frankman there says, leaders need to understand that personal feelings or beliefs cannot interfere with professional decisions. They must remain focused on the mission. I'm going to tell you that for later, because that is a home run on that one. That is a good one, Frank. What are the opportunities exist to improvement in the community infrastructure, facilities, and amenities? It's something you have to look at, the facilities and amenities. I know we're doing COVID-19 now. Most everybody is home. But during a disaster, you got to look at the facilities and what they have. Are there key events of historical and cultural issues that must be considered and preserved as part of the recovery? That's a great one. I'm going to read that again. Are there key events and historical or cultural issues that must be considered and preserved as part of the recovery? Yes, they are. How should the recent and long-term change in the demographics be considered when planning for the recovery programs and the projects? Communities change from the beginning to the present day, constantly changing around. I have another question for you. How do sustainability and mitigation issues relate to decisions about recovery? So I want y'all to take the time to answer that one. How do sustainability and mitigation issues relate to decisions about recovery? The sound's cutting in and out. All right, Marie, can you hear me now?
Patrick, I can confirm your audio.
Okay, thanks. All right, let's look at what must a leader set the tone for the cooperation. In the setting for the tone for cooperation, leaders must be visible, proactive throughout the process that constantly goes on. Doing so, they would attain essential community support and recovery initiatives. Getting involved. They may find it necessary to lobby for support from recovery initiatives. They include both political and financial support. They got a lobby for, may include hosting the VIPs, as I said earlier, community groups and their partners, getting involved, networking, potential benefactors of special projects and programs. A leader must always be in cooperation. Here's some, I'm going to go through some examples very quick and involve partners in recovery planning and programs. Business associates is a big one. Special interest groups. If y'all have any that y'all know of, special interest groups in your community, put them in the question box. Some neighborhood associates. A leader must be able to pull in cultural groups. Leaders must need to be able to clearly instruct and the mission and facilitate clear communication. That's a big one, Tammy. If you have goals that are sustainable and included mitigation measures, then you can obtain your vision. You're right, Nancy. They can look at hospitals and clinics, major employers. I've seen that happen. Pull in major employers and potential partners. Let's look at some interview relationships here. One of the things the leadership must determine is the most appropriate way to manage the recovery and the task of personnel accordingly. That is a big one. They must determine the most appropriate way to manage recovery and the task of personnel accordingly. As it says here, a leader will need to establish trust, cooperation with outside agencies and other jurisdictions to help aid the recovery effort. As I said earlier, mutual aid in neighboring counties, mutual interest. Cross jurisdictions damage. Damage doesn't happen in one location, it also happen in another. Some of the common issues in the county or the city or the state. Some of the things a leader can look at. What are the common issues? Let's look at the roles of recovery manager. In NDRF, it recommends some important and local disaster recovery managers to be identified by the senior elected officials. Following the incident requires coordinated recovery efforts. This is something that they got to look at, senior elected officials. This is some individuals that in the needs of position are intended to serve a primary point of contact for all the recovery issues in their jurisdictions and responsible for managing the details of the recovery process. Some of the things to look at, to coordinate recovery programs for leadership, as I said, to oversee the broad range of projects and programs. As I said earlier, manage the details. That is a big one. To ensure the management staff are working together to reach the established goals and community vision for the recovery. I know somebody mentioned that earlier in the question box. Community priorities of local leadership ensuring the inclusive recovery process. Let's look at the recovery task force here. The recovery task force, they can take a variety of forms. If you know some, put them in the question chat. The composition of recovery task force may vary from disaster to disaster. It may be fluid and adapt to the current needs of the recovery process. That's what happens. It may also have numerous subcommittees addressing various needs of our project. Some of the subcommittees consist of infrastructure restoration. That's one of them. A business recovery That's a big one. Community revitalization. That's something they can look at, Recovery Task Force. Anybody know any others? Put it in the question box. All right, I know we went over several things during this lesson. Of course, this was a short one today. Now, we covered the actions of a community leader that can take manage recovery to lead the community through the recovery. That's one of the things we looked at. We looked at some sources of financial assistance available to the community, and then the function and the unmet needs of the committee. That's what we went over earlier today. And the importance of proper documentation. So I know FEMA asks for a lot of documentation: force account labor, rental equipment summaries, material summaries, benefit calculators, travel documents. They look for a lot of this. Apply the learning points to solve problems faced by a recovery task force. Some of the things you can look at when you have your recovery task force developed. Are there any questions, any comments for today's unit? I know we had some audio issues in the beginning. I know we have several questions in the chat box. If you have one, please put it in there, and so me and Nick can respond accordingly. As Nick said earlier, he has 2 documents inside the handout section for your use. Please take the time to download that. Nick?
And for those on the line who have had audio issues, we're going to go ahead and distribute a recording of this lesson to everybody once it's available, and to make sure you guys can, if you did miss it in the audio, miss in the information, you can go back and rewatch it, and to make sure you catch all that. Patrick, you have any last words?
No, I do not. Thanks everybody for joining. Thanks everybody for listening in. If I went too fast, please put it in the comment box. Please let me know. I'm always looking for corrections, anything. And once again, thanks for joining.